Welcome to the Living Loud and Proud podcast, brought to you by Disability Pride, Pennsylvania. If you need a link to the transcript for this episode, please visit our accessible website at www.disabilitypridepa.org/podcast. And now, here is your host. Hi, folks. Welcome to the Living Loud and Proud podcast. Producer Phill Rosen here. My co-producer Ray Horton is listening in.
Hello, folks.
Today we have Wendy Elliott-Vandivier on to discuss her history as a disability advocate, as well as her history as an artist. But first, I want to thank our sponsor, Highmark Whole Care, for sponsoring the show.
Yay!
Without you, this would not be possible. Now, Wendy, thanks for coming on.
Hi, Wendy.
Hi, thank you for having me.
All right. So, Wendy Elliott-Vandivier is a graduate of Tyler School of Art at Temple University. She's been making art since she was a young child growing up in Philly. In college, she majored in sculpture and staged a funeral of a disabled poster child to lay stereotypes of pity and helplessness firmly to rest. Her paintings explore issues of family, memory, and experiences as a disabled woman. Her autobiographical cartoons focus on attitudinal barriers and stereotypes regarding disabilities and some of the microaggressions that disabled people experience while living normal, uninspirational lives. She is also a photographer of microscale monuments in nature and is often inspired by close-up images that people often do not notice in daily life: tree bark, dead leaves, flower anatomy, and water. Wendy is also a lifelong disability rights activist and has held leadership positions at the Philadelphia Mayor's Commission on People with Disabilities, Disabled in Action of PA, American Association of People with Disabilities, and United Spinal Association of Greater Philadelphia. Wendy is a teaching artist, melding her art with her disability activism. She conducts art workshops on microaggressions and ableism, creating a welcoming and safe space for people of all ages to create cartoons of their own and engage in meaningful discussions about racism, sexism, homophobia, ageism, and other forms of discrimination. She tailors her programs for various age groups from kindergarten, elementary, high school students and beyond. She's also conducted training for universities, businesses, and religious organizations. To Wendy, it is all about repairing the world, making it a better place for all. Wow, that is quite a bit there, Wendy. So I guess I just want to get started on how did you get started as a disability advocate?
Well, I got started probably in my late teens, early 20s. I never knew any other people with disabilities when I was growing up. I was always mainstreamed in regular Philadelphia public schools. I was always the only disabled kid in the classroom or, in the school, and I never knew anybody like me. And I was interested because my parents were told that I had to go to the special segregated school for children with disabilities, Widener Memorial School, and I actually I refused. I said to my parents, why do I have to go to a special school? I want to go to the same school, where the other kids on my block were going. I didn't understand why this idea of going to the special school was even brought up. And my parents were really wonderful. They supported me in my desire to go to the regular school. My mother took me to school every day. The buses were not accessible, obviously. And she held my hand as I climbed up all the inaccessible schools, went up steps. I was able to walk then with my leg braces. I was born with spina bifida. So, she made things possible for me. I don't think I ever respected her and valued her as much. She's not, with us anymore, but I'm grateful for everything that she did for me. But I say all that because I didn't know anybody. I had no role models, didn't know anybody with a disability, when I was growing up. And it wasn't until I was in college and I read an article in the Philadelphia in the Sunday section of the Inquirer, and there was something about an activist named Mimi Nelkin, and she was one of the original founders of Disabled in Action of Pennsylvania. Also, in addition to Mimi, was Siggy Shapiro was one of the other founders. So I read this article about Mimi. She was an artist, a potter also, and I was just so struck by what she wrote in this article, and I looked up Disabled in Action. I actually joined it, finally met a whole community of people with disabilities, and that's how I got started, in disability activism, and I eventually became president of Disabled in Action. We were very instrumental in getting lifts on buses in the late 1970s, early 80s. I was president of DIA when we sued the city of Phill. We sued SEPTA, our local transportation authority, because they wouldn't put lifts on the buses. We took over a SEPTA board meeting at one point. We demonstrated in the streets, blocked traffic. I was never arrested for any of these stunts because the paddy wagons were not accessible back then. They couldn't get us. They couldn't arrest us because they couldn't get us into the paddy wagons. They did try to arrest my husband, and Steve Gold was there. They tried to arrest Harvey Finkel, who was our photographer. Mm-hmm. This is all very early days in disability civil rights in Philadelphia. And we were very successful. We got lifts on buses.
Yeah. Just out of curiosity, what year was that you sued the Philly government? Do you remember?
I believe it was around in 1980, 81. Don't quote me. I have to double check the exact date. But it was early 80s, and I was in my 20s at the time, and it was very empowering. We really wanted to make things happen, in Philadelphia.
Yeah. So how do you maintain that kind of drive, that commitment for advocacy? How do you, has there been really any changes in focus over the years? I mean, the 80s was, 40 years ago.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious.
Yeah, well, I've maintained my energy and enthusiasm for advocacy for a long time. I feel it's something that that I just naturally do. I want to make the world a better place. There's a concept called Tikkun Olam, making the world a better place. That's in Hebrew, and it's really what I'm about. When I experience something myself, or I want to help others. Also, I want to do something about it. I don't want to just complain. I want to, take action. And, my advocacy has changed over the years. I used to do these things on the streets and, demonstrating, and I've toned it down a little bit in my older years. I'm doing more working within the system, working with legislators. I'm co-president right now of the United Spinal Greater Philadelphia Area Chapter, and we do a roll on Capitol Hill every year. And we also do a statewide roll on Harrisburg, where we have our 4 chapters getting together to advocate on all kinds of issues like accessible parking, abusive accessible parking issues, access to trails, other public accommodations, and trying to get wheelchair repair, getting a program in place that would allow people with disabilities to get their wheelchair repaired and covered under insurance, at least 2 times a year. So I've been doing things like that. I haven't been, getting myself arrested or being out on the street as much, but I think there's a lot of ways, to advocate. And I've been just doing it, for a really long time, and it gives me strength, and I hope that it helps, other people with disabilities.
Yeah. So, I kind of want to move focus a little bit. So we've mentioned a lot of leadership roles between your bio and just now you were talking about, DIA, United Spinal. So what has that kind of looked like in terms of your advocacy for the disability community? Has there been anything of note that you've been involved in that, wasn't necessarily mentioned as part of that?
Well, I can mention is in my role as president of DIA, like 40 years ago, where we were we got our first independent living center, established.
Oh.
I When I was president of DIA, we had a committee on independent living, and we established our first independent living center in Philadelphia. It was called Resources for Living Independently, and it was a storefront place in West Philly. It was at 4721 Pine. It was right next to the apartment building where I used to live, the Garden Court Plaza, 4701 Pine. So this was like, two places down, right on Pine Street. It was a small storefront. I cut the ribbon when we started our first center and hired the first executive director. And that little tiny center with, like 2 staff people has grown, over the last 30 years, and now it's called, and when I started, it was called Resources for Living Independently, RLI, and now it's Liberty Resources. And it's become one of the, the best independent living centers in the, in the country. So those are the kinds of things, that I'm proud of most for, for helping to start those things, in our community.
Wow. That's really amazing. So, you started making art when you were very young. Do you happen to remember, like, exactly what age you started making art? Like, did you go to school at that time?
I started making art when I was a little kid, maybe 3, 4 years old. I remember drawing, little self-portraits and in crayons, and I wish I could find it. It's probably somewhere in the basement of my house. Right. I used to do little sculptures. I remember making a small horse's head out of Play-Doh, and I was always using my hands and making art, even when I was a little kid. It was something I always enjoyed doing. I was good at it, and I used to always illustrate things. Like in high school, I would be the art editor of the school magazine, and illustrating everything. But I always loved making art. And then I went to school for art, where I majored in sculpture at Tyler School of Art, Temple University. My parents were not happy with me, my decision to go to art school. They wanted me to be a doctor or a lawyer because I was always a straight A student. I was graduated near the top of my class, and I was good at academics. And they had a different idea for me, but I always wanted to be an artist.
Wow. So, you majored in sculpture. Did your advocacy inform your art, as you were growing up, or did that kind of evolve later in your life?
My advocacy informed my art when I was in college.
In college,
I mentioned that I did the performance art piece. We used to do a lot of performance art. Back in I started college in 1979, and we were doing a lot of performance pieces. And the piece I did with burying a poster child, I literally built this coffin and put this little poster child thing inside of it. And I dug the hole and had all my classmates were around me, and we literally buried this poster child. We just could not stand these negative images of these poor, pitiful, people with disabilities. That was when the Jerry Lewis telethon was always on, and I was always hooked when I saw that, and so that was my little statement about that. I used to also do a lot of things on the floor. I couldn't get up. A lot of my classes at Tyler at the time were not even accessible. One of my drawing classes, I had to literally crawl up the steps. I was using leg braces then, and eventually got a cane and crutches, but it was very difficult. So I was crawling up the steps, and I would do these. I would take different spaces, on the second floor, and I did these pieces where I put tape. It was like very thin, maybe like a 1/4 inch thick tape, and made these little designs on the ground. It was like a grid kind of thing, and then I had mirrors, that I would install in these spaces, and it changed your perspective of space.
Mm-hmm.
I did it on lower floors too, where it was accessible for me. I didn't have to do that. I even did it outside with with mirrors outdoors. I used to have a lot of friends at school, and my grandfather also came to me at school a lot and helped me carry all my art supplies. And so they were carrying wood and mirrors and stuff and helping me assemble. I was always more directing because I couldn't physically do the large scale environmental pieces that I wanted, but
Right.
a lot of people that were helping me, so I was the director. But I think even back then, my advocacy was informed by that. And I also used to do little collages where I would show, like a model. And I would be cutting things out of, this is before there was any computers or technology, and I was literally cutting pictures of models, wearing, sexy underwear, and I would put braces on them and crutches and stick them in a wheelchair. I was doing this stuff before anybody was even thinking about this. And that kind of led to, what I'm doing now with the art and microaggressions. And
Right. So, when did you kind of start highlighting microaggressions in cartoons? Did you do anything else before the cartoons highlighting microaggressions?
I didn't do it before the cartoons, and I was never a cartoonist, but I was so, as a sculptor, painter, I did a lot of photography, but I never did cartoons. And it wasn't when I was working. I worked as a human resources manager for many years. That's how I, was able to afford my house and having a son and all that. But I did that for 30 years, and towards like the end of my HR career, I remember people would always be making these comments as I was getting out of my van, like going across the parking lot, going to work. And people would say the most, bizarre things to me, like, it's good to see you out today, or you're so inspirational, as I'm just going down the lift and trying to get across the parking lot to get into the building. And I started writing things down, on a notepad app on my cell phone. I didn't really think I was going to do anything with it. I just started, putting it on the app. And eventually I would get an idea, to do a cartoon. And those were the first cartoons that I made. A guy that ran up to me as I was, getting down my lift, and he said to me, and this is an exact quote, "Boy, it's people like you who put my life in perspective. Like, things could be a lot worse. You could be me." So I started putting all these things together and made my first cartoon. It was called Woof the Expletive Deleted. And I say woof because I always put my service dog in the cartoons, Lucy, and I drew her with 3 heads representing different emotions as she was responding to these ridiculous comments that people were making to me. Even when I was an HR manager, I remember somebody coming in for an interview and was so surprised, "Are you the HR manager?" And could I be the one that was going to do your interview? So obviously they didn't get the job after that happens. Right? But different stories like that, and it was just really cathartic for me to make those cartoons at first, and just getting it out of my head, putting it on a cell phone app, getting out of my head and putting it into cartoons. And then I realized that it was not only cathartic for me, but it could help other people. It could help people with disabilities be proud of who they are, exactly the way they are, foster that community and disability pride. And it was also helping people without disabilities to see, what these comments do, to people like this, how they devalue us and, erase our identities. So it was I think it's been helpful creating those cartoons, and it's kind of mushroomed even more where I'm now doing presentations about the cartoons for all types of audiences. I'm showing them to elementary and secondary school students. I've been showing even to kindergartners. I've also been doing them for colleges and universities. I was even invited last year to do a workshop for medical students at Thomas Jefferson University Hospital. And I told them all about, myself and how I got started doing the cartoons, showed them, um, all the cartoons in a PowerPoint presentation. And then I engaged them in a hands-on art making workshop. And I was amazed that these medical students sat down with me and started drawing and enjoying it. And I asked people to get up, if they felt comfortable doing so, to get up and share, why they created what they did. And they could talk about microaggressions and ableism, any experiences that they had with the disability themselves, or maybe they had a friend or family member. And even if they didn't have any of those things, they could talk about any other isms that they experienced, whether it was racism, sexism, LGBTQ, and so forth, ageism. And I was amazed at what people came up with and how they shared. And we had really, great experiences, talking with each other, and learning about our experiences. So I really love doing this kind of work and want to, to do more of it with, with different kinds of audiences. Jefferson has invited me back this year, and I'm going to have an art show of my cartoons in the medical school library. So
that's really cool.
I'm really enjoying what I'm doing and feel that it's, I have more purpose and meaning than I was doing when I was hiring and firing people all day long and disciplining and training them and orienting.
So you really kind of, well, I mean, you just talked a little bit about your workshops that you put on. So you really kind of were, allowing kind of cross identity. Man, I am blanking on the exact word right now, but intersectionality. There we go. Man, my ADHD today. But anyways, so you really kind of highlighted intersectionality and allowed people to really speak to that through their art as well. And that's really interesting. Because, I think a lot of people might be surprised to kind of hear that someone who's going in with like a focus on their identity would be so open to allowing others to kind of talk about what, their identities may be or how art could be cathartic for that. Mm-hmm. And so that's really interesting to hear.
I love that. I did a thing for University of Delaware. I did it on my birthday. I was actually working on my birthday. And drove down to Delaware, did this presentation. There was 100 people there. It's like the largest group that I had ever done. And we were in large tables, like ballroom style tables, and everybody, drew their cartoons. They were very enthusiastic. And again, the same thing happened. People started opening up and sharing about other microaggressions, because of their other identities. And I just really loved, creating that safe space, where people could share and be themselves.
Yeah. So do you have any like advice for young artists who, want to have a career in art or maybe have it be kind of a side hustle? Like, like where to go, what to do? Like, do you have any sort of advice for them?
Well, I wish for myself that I didn't spend so much time doing other things. I worked for the Office for Civil Rights, U.S. Department of Education. This is when Clarence Thomas was our boss in Washington. And, and then I did that for 9 years and then 30 years in HR. But I wish I didn't spend so much time, doing that, just trying to make money, but have more of a balance in my life, because I feel, I wish I had not spent so much time doing that and took more of a risk, to just make my art or try to make a living out of my art. But to me, it doesn't really matter right now whether I'm making a living out of it or not. I'm really doing it to educate others, to make the world a better place. So that's my purpose right now in life. But paid for my son, went to school, got his PhD, got all the got our house paid off. But I couldn't have done all those things if I was probably starving artist, which
yeah, that's fair. And actually, I actually want to kind of circle back a little bit. You were talking about putting on workshops for kids in grade school. Is there anything that you were like involved in, like as part of a project, like I don't know, creating curriculum or anything involving like your art specifically?
Yeah, well, I was involved in a really wonderful project through uh, Disability Equality in Education. And Vicki was also very involved with this, and Connie. And I had a wonderful opportunity, to get a grant that was from the Developmental Disabilities uh, Council in the state of Pennsylvania, and I got a grant to produce a coloring book for kindergartners to second, third graders. And the coloring book was called A Day of Questions, and it was all about making kids feel comfortable, asking people with disabilities questions. A lot of times a kid will come up to me and try to ask me a question, and their parent is kind of dragging them away. Don't talk to that person. And I think, it instills more fear. That the kid starts to think that disability is a bad thing. I should not try to talk or interact with this person. So with this coloring book, that I illustrated my different experiences, taking them through my day, and having on the left side of the page there would be a kid, different ages, races, genders, and they would be asking me a question, and then I drew an illustration in response. Like one time, a little boy came up to me, and this is an exact quote. He said to me, "Where do you sleep?" And he was just very upset. Like he thought I had to sleep sitting up in my power wheelchair. And I had to explain to him that I do get out of bed, but I have a special lift. It's like a Hoyer, it's called a shorthand lift, but it lifts me up and then it goes along a track on the ceiling and then comes down. So I'm able to get in and out of bed. So my husband doesn't have to schlep me into bed all the time. But he just wanted to know. I told him I sleep, in a bed, and that's all he wanted to know, and he was on to the next thing. But so I was really grateful for him the opportunity to create that coloring book. And at the end of the book, I drew some lines and a pencil, and kids got to write, what are your questions? Or draw. In one section of it, I drew myself. They asked me, how do you dance? And I drew myself, dancing. I like to dance in my wheelchair. And I don't know if I'm good at it, but I like to dance in my wheelchair. And so I drew myself dancing, and then at the end of the coloring book, there's a section that says "Draw Yourself Dancing with Wendy." So it was really, really neat. And I did presentations as part of the Disability Equality in Education, visiting various public schools in Philadelphia, where I would read the book to the students. And Phill, you did a video of me with the book.
Yeah.
And that was a lot of fun, showing me getting in my van and driving off, or Lucy, my service dog, getting into the van and so forth, me dancing. And that was, those are things that really educate and, help the young people to understand people with disabilities more and feel comfortable, asking us questions. And it's going to make better people as they grow up and they're in the workplace or interacting with people with disabilities. So I love doing things like that, and hope to do more with young children. They're not afraid to ask me questions. They, their hands kept raising every. They had a million questions for me, but I really love doing that sort of thing.
Yeah, I remember finding music to go with your dancing, and that was a fun. Actually, that was one of the fun videos. All of them were fun in their own way, but I remember yours being particularly fun and having a lot of personality surrounding it.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice for young and or new disability advocates based on your experiences? I say or new because, some people become disabled later in life and are just starting out on their advocacy journey, maybe in their 40s, who knows?
Right.
So do you have any advice for them?
Well, I think I would encourage people to do something, to take action, not moan about all these problems that you're experiencing, but do something, to affect change. And recognize that these things take, a long time. We're still fighting. I've been doing this for, my first act of advocacy when I was 5 years old. And I'm not telling you how old I am right now, but I've been doing it a long time. And, the world has changed, quite a bit. There's still a long way to go. For me, advocating for lifts on buses, now I'm focusing on advocating for being able to get into an airplane and, being able to not have to give up my wheelchair and risk getting damaged or not be able to use a bathroom on a plane. I want to travel the world, and my husband wants to stay home and garden and put around the house, but I want to see more of the world. But I think not to be discouraged, because these things take time. There have been a lot of soldiers in the disability community. Before I was involved in it, in the late 70s, 80s, looking in the 1940s and 30s, that people were, starting these groups. When Eastern Paralyzed Veterans Association, when soldiers were coming back from wars and becoming disabled, and how a lot of these groups started working on these issues. But things have continued to grow and evolve, and it's going to continue to evolve. And I hope our future is fully accessible. We still have a lot of work to do. The ADA, while we've had it 34 years on the books, we need to have more access. Inclusion, across the board. More people with disabilities need to be employed. 60% of us are not working. But, 1 in 4 people in the country has a disability. Like 63,000 people, I think, in the U.S. has a disability. And I would like to, to see, there be change, that we're fully integrated in all aspects of society. We shouldn't have to give up our, Medicaid benefits if we get a job. And, for me, I never was on Medicaid. I was always working. So now I'm on Medicare. And that's another problem, because when you're older and you have a disability, then you're still not eligible for things. I'm not eligible to get attending care services unless I pay for things out of pocket. And so there's a lot of problems. People that want to get married, if they're on Medicaid, they can't get married because they risk losing their benefits. So there's still so many more things, that we need to work on. Access to medical care. That's something I've been doing a lot of speaking about, healthcare equity for people with disabilities. And I tell my own story about, as a wheelchair user, how difficult it is for me to access medical diagnostic equipment. My cat is meowing. Sorry.
It's all fine. He wants to get in on the conversation.
Yes, he has an opinion here about how long I should be doing this to work. So with the access to medical diagnostic equipment, mammograms, there should be accessible roll-on tables. When you exam tables, when you're at your doctor's office, a roll-on scale. I don't know how doctors for so many years were prescribing medication for me for different problems that I've had over the years, but they had no idea how much I weighed, because they couldn't get me on their scale. And this is totally outrageous thing. There's been a change to the Rehab Act, the Section 504 of the Rehab Act, and in 2 years, most medical offices are going to have accessible exam tables and roll-on scales. So I'm going to break the news to my GP that he has to do something. And he says to me, well, Wendy, I examine you in a wheelchair all the time. Well, you can't examine everything when I'm in a wheelchair.
Right, exactly.
So that's what I've been doing a lot. I've been speaking to medical students at University of Pennsylvania and Jefferson again, nursing students at University of Pennsylvania, and throughout the city. So I'm really grateful to be able to partner with some great people on that from other disability organizations, and we do a panel where we talk to about our own personal experiences. Like when I went to get a test at a hospital, and the person after I had done all the preparation for this test and rolled into the office, the person said to me, And this is an exact quote, "We don't take people like you here. You have to be seen in the main hospital." Here I did all the prep for this test, and I was not about to go home and do this again. But those types of things, or going to another doctor's office where I had to get on an exam table, and it was like a 4-foot high exam table, and I said I can't do it, and I can't have my husband expect him to lift me onto this exam table. And the nurse said to me, and this is an exact quote, she said, "For our safety and your safety, we cannot lift you." And this was a practice that specialized in treating with people with disabilities who became disabled through spinal cord injuries. And this was her response to me. And unbelievable stuff that happened. So I'm saying all this to say that there's still a lot of work to be done. That we still have to be patient and understand where our place is in the disability history, and it's going to take a long time before we see full access and equality for people with disabilities. And just be patient, do what you can do, and feel proud of what you're doing, but keep up the fight and mentor people younger than you to continue that fight.
Yeah. I just want to say that some people may have just heard me chuckle. Ray had some choice gestures and words that he was mouthing in the background. I was not laughing at these things. I want to make that clear. Not that it's,
Yeah, I saw Ray.
I've heard a lot of these
explanation. I definitely had to let them know how I felt about that statement that the nurse said. It involved appendages on my hand being down except for 1 or 2. Okay.
But
being directed, of course, at the staff at that doctor's office.
Some egregious things that go on, and a lot of people with disabilities don't even, bother. I've even been told that if you want to be lifted onto the table, you need to come, to the appointment by ambulance. Be lifted on a stretcher.
Yeah,
and I don't need to be on a stretcher. I just need for the nurses or the doctors to use the Hoyer lift.
That's horrible.
Just roll out the lift and and just do it, because it's our right. We deserve to have the same access to healthcare as anybody else.
Yeah, I have to admit there have been multiple things that my wife has talked about with doctors in their bedside manner that just make me absolutely horrified. She's a wheelchair user as well, so for people who may not know. But anyways, we could actually probably keep going on for hours and hours and hours. But Wendy, I think it's about time for us to wrap up this conversation. So I actually wanted to give you a chance to, shout out where people can find you online. Sell yourself. Maybe
sell them. Let them know, Wendy.
Well, if you're interested in learning more about me and my art, if you'd like to see some examples of my art or learn more about the workshops that I've been doing, you can visit my website, which is www.wendyevart.com. So it's www.wendyevart.com. And you can get in touch with me. You can email me through the website. Be happy to get back with you if you'd like to learn more about what I do. But thank you so much for the opportunity to be on this podcast. I'm grateful for all the work that Phill and Ray are doing as well. And
thank you.
Proud to know you.
And it's always been a pleasure in my life having you there. And by the way, folks, just in case if you don't know, Wendy was talking about her age, right? And I'm going to tell you right now, okay, I look young for my age, and she looks younger than me, okay? I just had to put that out there,
Thank you. I'm well preserved.
Very.
Well, Wendy, thank you for coming on. It's always a pleasure to talk with you. And I want to just close out by thanking our sponsors, Highmark Whole Care again. And thank you for listening, everyone. We'll see you at the next one.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
please visit our accessible website at www.disabilitypridepa.org. You can find us on social media at Disability Pride PA on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok.